Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the inaugural discussion sponsored by the Goldman Forum on the Press and Foreign Affairs. It would be difficult to imagine a moment in the recent history of the United States in which a discussion of the coverage of foreign affairs by the American press would be more appropriate. America's relationship with the world has changed substantially in the period since September 11, 2001, and there are few topics of greater importance than the questions that surround how Americans obtain their information about the world from the press. Thus, we owe a deep debt of gratitude to the Goldman family and the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Fund for sponsoring this event and the series of which this is the first program. The Goldman family has frequently and generously stepped forward to assist the campus in achieving the excellence to which this university is committed. We will be forever in their debt. Someone once said that they would never live anywhere where they could not hear the slap of the New York Times being delivered to their front steps in the morning. Today, through the miracles of technology, we can live virtually anywhere in the country and enjoy the benefit of having the New York Times delivered to our front door. It is America's newspaper, a newspaper that devotes more space, I would guess many times more space, to foreign affairs than any other newspaper in America. If we believe, as Walter Lippmann put it, a free press is not a privilege, but an organic necessity in a great society, the New York Times has played a central role in maintaining a free society in America. We need only to recall its role in the publication of the Pentagon Papers to be reminded of how the New York Times has made certain that information essential to the formation of democratic public policy was made available to the American people. Universities have much in common with the press, for the freedom under which we both function effectively is rooted in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Both bear heavy responsibilities for educating the American people to think critically about the central issues of the day. Both must give protection to the expression of views that go against the grain. Both are among the first targets of those who would suppress our liberties. Tonight, we are privileged to participate in a discussion with leaders from both of these sentinel institutions, discussing the role of the New York Times in educating the American people about the world. We have from the New York Times publisher Arthur Salzberger, Jr. and executive editor Howell. From the Graduate School of Journalism, we have Dean Orville Schell and Professor Mark Danner. Please welcome Dean Schell to initiate this program.
Well, thanks. It's truly wonderful to have you all here. It's long been my conviction that a university, particularly a public university, should be a place where people who are in academia interact with people off the campus, particularly on some of the great issues that perplex our world. And actually, I can think of no more crucial issue than the question of the media, which we will discuss tonight. It's wonderful that we've been able to do this with the New York Times. They've been enormously generous. It's part of a series that we have done over the last few years. I urge you all to go and see a really wonderful photography exhibit by Vincent Laforet and Ruth Remsen at the Graduate School of Journalism Gallery. And we had an event yesterday with Michael Kimmelman, the chief art critic. So it's been a great pleasure to have all of them out here. None of this would happen, of course, without a wonderful faculty at our school who works entirely too hard, and a staff and faculty working together. It's a great pleasure for me as dean to work with them. And it wouldn't happen also without a lot of you who are here, who have quietly supported both the school and the university. And it's not often, we get a chance to say thank you to you. And we can in some way do that with these events. Dick Goldman, thanks. Wouldn't be here without you. Nan McAvoy, Nadine Tang, Susie and Mark Buell, Steve Silberstein, Peter Haas, Jack Edelman, Dick Blum, Topher Delaney, Walter Shorenstein, Herb and Marion Sandler, John Gage and Linda Schacht, Amy Tan. I could go on, and I'm sure I've forgotten all too many, but thank you. It makes a tremendous difference to us. And there's one person I haven't mentioned. Every morning before dawn, a huge pile of New York Times has arrived at the journalism school. And almost every student that wants one gets one free. And this is the gift of Herb McLaughlin, an architect who has chosen to help us out this way. And I must say, for us, I mean, it's a bit like missionaries in far-flung places receiving, free Bibles. It truly is the Lord's work. So thanks to Herb McLaughlin. Now, without further ado, let me introduce Mark Danner, who is a professor at the journalism school, who will say a few words about Howell Raines and the editor of the New York Times, and Arthur Salzberger, the publisher.
Thank you, Orville. Excuse me. As the Chancellor mentioned, the Goldman Forum on the Press and Foreign Affairs was conceived in the days after 9/11 in conversations between Orville and myself. And out of the perception that after 9/11, foreign affairs in a certain way ceased to be foreign. You could be sitting at your desk having coffee, talking to a client on the phone, getting your restaurant ready for lunch, and foreign affairs in the person of those who resisted American power and were determined to confront it could come out of the sky and kill you. We felt it was vital to establish on campus a forum for the discussion of issues very much of the moment, issues that affected all of us. The program tonight is based on another perception as well, which is that we live in a very unusual country at this moment in history. It is a kind of minotaur, a composite. On the one hand, an empire, on the other hand, a democracy. When it tries to extend its power, our leaders feel obliged to convince the citizenry to go along. The news media and the New York Times, more than any other organ of opinion, the dominant organ of opinion, is critical to that task, is critical to persuade us, as we've been seeing in the last couple months, for example, to go to war with Iraq. We would like to get into those issues tonight and find out how, indeed, we all arrive at our views of America and the world. Let me introduce the two distinguished gentlemen we'll be talking to, who have made a living out of, I think as Arthur Salzberger said, the fine art of slathering ink on dead trees. Just to give you a sense of the gravity of the occasion. Arthur Oakes Salzberger, Jr., publisher of the New York Times and chairman of the New York Times Company, is the scion of the family that has controlled the Times for now more than a century. He graduated in political science from Tufts in 1974. He worked as a reporter in the Raleigh Times, North Carolina. He served as a correspondent for the Associated Press in London. Went to the Times Washington Bureau as a correspondent, was a Metro reporter, assistant Metro editor, and then served various terms of duty in the production department, the business department, corporate planning, until in 1992 he succeeded his father as publisher. He became chairman of the Times Company in 1997. Howell Raines was born in Birmingham in 1943, Birmingham, Alabama. He started his newspaper career in several Alabama papers, including the Birmingham Post-Herald, the Tuscaloosa News, and the Birmingham, Alabama News. He was political editor at the Atlantic Constitution and then at the St. Petersburg Times of Florida before he joined the Times, where he served in Atlanta. He was the White House correspondent, national political correspondent, deputy Washington editor. He served a term in London as bureau chief, was then Washington editor, editorial page editor, and finally, in 2001, I should say September 7th, 2001, became executive editor of the New York Times. He's published several books, including Fly Fishing Through the Midlife Crisis. Buy it. It will help you. A novel, Whiskey Man, 1977, and My Soul is Rested, a wonderful oral history of the civil rights era. And he also won a Pulitzer Prize in '92 for a beautiful essay called Grady's Gift in the New York Times Magazine. Gentlemen, let the games begin.
Well, it's great to have you both here. So let's dive in. Maybe begin by telling us what you do.
I've never thought about that.
We just come to auditoriums, big auditoriums full of people, and we just do a shtick.
Well, commence.
As publisher of the New York Times, I'm responsible for the overall responsibility for the newspaper. That includes the news department and the business side, as well as our editorial board, which reports separately from our news department. And as chairman of the company, I've got sort of overarching strategic responsibility for the company. I don't even know how to think about this question. I think a lot about the future. Yes, and
Pretty basic stuff.
And trying to keep people aligned against the set of strategic goals that we have, both from the New York Times newspaper and from the corporate level.
Howell?
As executive editor, I have responsibility. I think a lot about the next 24 hours, actually. And I have responsibility for supervising a worldwide news staff of 1,130 people. And that's a pretty time-consuming enterprise. And I could go on in great detail, but I think the thing that we always keep foremost in our mind at the Times is we exist to serve the information needs of our audience. We feel we have an intellectual contract with the people who buy the Times to tell them as much as we can, as fully as we can, and as soon as we can, what we find out about the world. And that's pretty much what I do every day when I get up.
You both enjoy your jobs?
Yeah, this is a really good job I have. I don't know. I mean, I'm measuring against covering the Board of Education for the Birmingham Post-Herald. This is a lot better.
That's setting the bar high. Actually, maybe in finding out what you do for a living, which I think is a good place to start, we can dive right into the process of what you do at the paper. I'm looking at today's edition, which many of you may have looked at today. I have a feeling in the audience. And if you didn't look at it, you'll have seen during the course of the day the influence of the Times coursing through the information system of the country, through the television stations, cable stations, networks. We have a lead, U.S. taking steps to lay foundation for action in Iraq. How did this story get to the front page, and why is this news today? Since presumably last week, the U.S. was laying the foundation. Right. Why is this the lead of the New York Times?
There's a genre that one of my city editors told me about years ago. It said, you write a lead that says, thus and so, comma, old newspaper clips revealed today.
This is a more candid answer than I expected.
This particular story actually is one that I'm pleased with. I mean, one of the things that I do is I try to give myself a grade based on what's in the paper and what I brought to it. And one of the glories of our paper is that we have a lot of people thinking every day, every moment about what the news is. Every now and then I think it's useful for somebody to come in and try to bring a value-added idea. This was about last Wednesday, I think. I was reading or watching some broadcast that triggered in my mind the idea, well, when you talk about going to war, what has to happen before you do that? What has to happen diplomatically? What has to happen politically in the country? And what has to happen logistically in the military? What has to happen in the intelligence community? I thought it would be useful, not because it's breaking news or spot news, but because I thought it would be useful for our readers to take a look at all the things that have to fall into place before war can begin. So that was sort of the impulse. I asked that question and asked our Washington Bureau to start working on the story for the weekend that would try to answer it.
So this is a story that really originated in your mind and came down from the top.
I mean, normally, I try to have one really good idea a day. And because I feel that if I can think of one thing that nobody else had the time to do, I've brought something to the paper.
The rest of us try to figure out what that idea was.
We're trying to figure here.
The Britney Spears front page story was one of those.
We're going to get to that.
Was that a preemptive mention?
Yes, I was going to say that was coming up.
I have no apologies for that. I'll dilate on that at some length.
let me ask, I think we'd like to stay on Iraq perhaps for a bit, and the coverage, not only what the coverage has been, but what it will be in the event of war. But let me ask you, Arthur Salzberger, you are involved, obviously, as you mentioned, when you answered the question of what you do for a living, in forming editorial policy. The Times has been fairly critical on its editorial page of President Bush's idea of going to war against Iraq. How are those opinions formed? Does the publisher speak frequently to the editorial page editor to come up with that position? How does that happen?
It's an iterative process. And yes, Gail Collins, our editorial page editor, and I will talk. In fact, every Wednesday, Gail and Howell and Gerald Boyd, our managing editor, and Janet Robinson, who's the head of our business side, runs the business operations of the paper, and I have lunch. And we've been doing this for a long time, when it was not some of those people at the table. I've been doing this from the beginning of '92 when I became publisher. And we try to just talk about issues that we're facing, sometimes business issues, sometimes personnel issues, sometimes tough issues regarding editorial positions. But in the end, Gail has an extraordinarily talented group of men and women who are the editorial board at the Times, and they have a lot more knowledge and understanding of the world around us than I do, a lot more experience. But on something critical like this, the paper can't get too far from where I'm comfortable, and sometimes that means I have to move, and that they move me. So.
How does that happen? I mean, do they actually bring you a draft editorial, or do you?
Sometimes, but on the whole, mostly it's just sitting down and talking with Phil Taubman, our deputy editorial page editor, with Gail, with one or two of the editorial page editorial board members who's specifically focused on this topic. And we have spent actually on this case a lot of time trying to get ourselves comfortable with where we were, not trying to get ourselves positioned in a box where we couldn't get out of, but not being dragged anywhere by the administration or others where we felt it would be inappropriate for us to go. We have a focus on civil liberties that's you'll see, you've already seen some of that in our editorials. You'll see more of that in the days and weeks to come. And a sense that of internationalism that's deeply ingrained in the New York Times and has been from the days of Adolph Ox, my great-grandfather, when he bought the paper. So I think you're seeing that reflected in the editorial coverage. And the process is not really very different from when Howell was the editorial page editor and we were struggling with, say, the Clinton matters.
How did it come to pass? I mean, you mentioned that the paper has a real internationalist slant. It's self-evident. But the common wisdom in the media at large is very much of late that foreign news doesn't sell. Now we're about to go to war with Iraq, and I assume you're going to be all over that story. How is it that you alone seem to have broken free of the gravity of that presumption that foreign people don't want to hear foreign news, they don't want to pay for foreign news, and we're not going to do a lot of it?
Well, I don't think we're alone, quite frankly. I think you've seen some very good reporting from the Washington Post, from the Los Angeles Times, from other papers, the Wall Street Journal. I think, as much as I appreciate that thought, I think that there are others in the same journalistic space that we are. It's funny, as you go back to the history of the New York Times, and we recently reviewed this when we made the decision to purchase the full ownership of the International Herald Tribune, the international marketplace has been one the New York Times has had its eyes on since it was founded in the 1850s. We started a European edition in about 2 or 3 years after 1851, when the Times was founded. It failed miserably. And we have a long history of doing that ever since. But maybe it's being part of a port city, of an immigrant city. That could be a part of why it's in our DNA. But it is, and it is deeply. When Adolph Fox took ownership, he moved foreign news, international news, to the front of the newspaper, and he said at the time, "We are all of us, first of all, citizens of the world."
But how do you make a go of it from the business sense, whereas other people claim they can't?
Because it's part of a package that speaks directly to the kind of readers that we have, and who have a sense of themselves and their place in the world. If it was just foreign news, it wouldn't work. If it was just cultural news, it wouldn't work. But it's the full range of human endeavor that we cover, and that speaks I think, to the audience. They do recognize that what happens outside their immediate sphere of influence has a direct impact, and of course the events of 9/11 have brought that to a larger audience, and we have been able to make use of that as well. Our circulation has been growing in part because of that. But it's not just a financial, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not just a financial equation that's focused on foreign news. Our financial equation is focused on quality journalism across the board, and that's what makes it work for us.
I'd like to keep on with this for another second, because I know you said earlier today, or Howell said earlier today, in talking about 9/11, that he knew that morning that there would be a section of the paper in which several $100,000 worth of ads would be thrown out. Not only did he know that, he didn't make a phone call to you to confirm it, and he assumed that if there was a problem, you'd call him, which is rather remarkable. How are you able to do that when other papers can't? And this gets into also, obviously, the issue of a nation challenge of the entire section that famously did not have ads, which presumably cost a hell of a lot of money. How can you do that, business-wise?
2 or 3 reasons. One, we are a highly profitable newspaper. We have moved, and that's not actually, I didn't mean for that to be a laugh line. We're actually proud we're actually proud of that fact.
But what does it mean? I mean, what are you looking for in terms of profit? I mean, we know that Knight Ridder just doesn't go to sleep happy unless they get that 22%. How about you?
I'd rather stay with the first question.
Well, you can answer it in
I'll let
an
Howell
elusive
answer
way.
the Knight Ridder question. I know Jay Harris is in the audience. We've moved more, and the folks in this audience know this as well as anyone. We've moved more and more. Our circulation costs have gone up. The paper is not an inexpensive paper to buy. We think the value is there, but one of the things we try to do is ensure that the value is there. And finally, it's what we do. It's the business we're in. We're in the business of journalism. And yes, we need profit to support what we do in journalism, but that's the reason for profit, to support what we do in journalism. And an event like 9/11 comes along, the greatest event in our journalistic history, I think, personal history now, a story that is really is going to have has had and will continue to have enormous repercussions for this country and the world, and that's where you have to commit to funding it the way it ought to be funded. And we can do it because we have the New York Times Magazine, and we have the circuit section, and we have all those other elements that not only provide, I hope, useful and important journalism, but bring with them a tremendous amount of advertising revenue. And we can do it because we have our subscription base and our circulation revenue that helps support this enormous news operation that Howell runs.
Orville, I think another thing that's interesting to think about in this context is breaking down the question in terms of audience and also in terms of news organizations. We can speculate about what the news media is interested in when it comes to foreign affairs. We can speculate or even measure with polls what the American people's interest level is in foreign affairs. But I know, as a matter of direct contact with our staff and through them with our readers, that we have 1.2 million readers every weekday, or buyers of our paper every weekday, subscribers, and 1.8 million on Sunday who are intensely interested in the subject of foreign affairs. That's why they come to us. It's what we call the quality information audience. And we think that's a growing audience. Arthur and his colleagues are in charge of the economics of this, but I can see, in terms of our news budget and our staffing, that we are expanding our foreign policy coverage. Other people are contracting, particularly broadcast entities. But in our case, we were measuring this the other day. I think 5 years ago we had something like 26 or 27 foreign bureaus. Now we have 29. We have more reporters by ramped up 1, 2, 3 people for each of those. So it's simply something that is a response to events in the world, and it's also a response to the interest needs of our readership.
Is it fair to say that because, in a way, because others are contracting, that is really a benefit to you, because the Times more and more is the place to find foreign coverage as others get rid of it? So others' misfortune on this level is really a benefit to the Times, which is branded in a way and covering the world?
That's a way of saying we want our newspaper to become more indispensable to more people who we think ought to be subscribing to the New York Times. And we actually think we have a sense of how many people there are out there who are potential readers for our paper. Yeah, I mean, we want to become more essential, and we want to do that by the way we present the world to them.
Let's get back a second, I think, to something where the Times really will be essential, we hope, which is if this war comes in Iraq. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how you are going about preparing for this. I mean, last time, you said earlier that the Gulf War was the least reported major conflict since Sherman's March to the Sea. And we all remember correspondents essentially locked in hotels in Dhahran. What is the process by which you go about preparing to cover this war, and in particular, getting around Pentagon restrictions, who Pentagon very naturally are going to want it covered its way?
I had the experience of being the Washington bureau chief during the Gulf War, and there we learned how captive our reporters became to the Pentagon press pool. And we also learned that because of the configuration of the battlefield in the first Gulf War, it was very difficult to filter our people in if we weren't already pre-positioned. So when Afghanistan came along, we spent a lot of time putting seasoned reporters and photographers around the perimeter of that country and in distant locations where we felt they had a fair chance of getting visaed to come in, or to come in with military operations, including those of the Allied nations, so that we were prepared there in a way we were not prepared in the Gulf War to get our people into the theater. And as it happened, the chaos of that war and the relatively restricted areas around Afghanistan enabled us to get first-hand knowledge of the battlefield. It's not, to some degree, it's a satisfying tactical mission to figure out how to get there, but it has a journalistic rationale. Vietnam was probably the best reported war in American history as far as the press having access to the battlefield. The reason I mentioned Sherman was because there is a historical footnote there that's rather interesting. When Sherman had sacked Atlanta and decided to go to the sea to break the back of the Confederacy in an economic sense, he knew that he was going to wage a kind of warfare against civilian installations and civilian populations that had not been seen before on the American continent. And so he left no reporter went from Atlanta to Savannah to Columbia, South Carolina, where they finally wound up. I have no problem saying that Sherman was on the right side of the issue, but the fact is the kind of war that was being waged was one that the government wanted to keep hidden, and I think that's an important fact to consider. Vietnam, American and world journalists had more access to the battlefield than in any war, including probably World War II. So as students of that history, Powell and Cheney set out to create a restricted information environment in the Gulf War, and I presume that's what they will try to do in this war. And we'll try to be ready because at the end of the day, our commitment is to our readers.
Are you in negotiations with the Pentagon? I mean, will there actually be talks about access and possibly legal action? I mean, we all know that during the Gulf War, other press institutions did go to the courts and try to seek access. Yeah. How will that work now? Are you trying to negotiate with them?
There's not much negotiating to be done. I was in the original discussion groups between the Washington bureau chiefs and the Pentagon about shaping the Pentagon press pool. It was in the early 90s. It was kind of an abstract operation, and then when the Gulf War, or late 80s, when the Gulf War came along, then the press pool became institutionalized, and it's not going to change. It has its place. You have a reporting pool that's flown to an aircraft carrier that's off the shore of a country, and there's a value in having a presence there. But to get the unrestricted information about the war, about what's happening in the war on the ground, that's not a very good instrument. And there's really no negotiation to be done there. It is what it is. It will operate the way it is. We'll be represented. Other institutions, press organizations will be represented. But there's not much. It's their show, they being the Defense Department. So we are looking for other means of information.
When our country, or indeed any country, goes to war, there's a whole new set of imperatives that come into effect: patriotism, security. And I'm wondering if you both have had experience where a story, which wouldn't necessarily endanger troops, but certainly would defy common wisdom, or would seem grossly unpatriotic to many, where you've felt you've had to change it, hold it, and we may be in for a bout of this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had a case like that just a few months ago, if I'm not mistaken. It was a lead of the paper regarding the military plans at the time for the invasion of Iraq. Mm-hmm. And it caused, when we reported the story, it caused a great furor among many in government and people, and just Americans, that somehow the New York Times was leaking secret battle plans, and thereby endangering potential future actions and the lives of our troops. In truth, and we didn't talk about it at the time, but we have talked about it subsequently, we made sure before that story was printed that if there were things in there that were legitimate military secrets that would endanger lives, that the military had a chance to tell us that, and we had a chance to consider whether we wanted those elements in the story. And we did, in fact, pull a few what are not great elements out at their request. And furthermore, Howell and I made clear that if that wasn't enough, because that was a negotiations that took place between our now Washington bureau chief and the Defense Department, that we were at the ends of phones if the President or the Secretary of Defense wanted to call. They never did. So yes, we do deal with those situations, not very frequently, but we do occasionally do that.
Of course, the question one could ask is, given a leak like that, what makes that news? I mean, somebody, as you know well from both of your experience in Washington, somebody always has an agenda, or almost always has an agenda behind that kind of a leak. And indeed,
on that fact.
Yes, God bless them. And I have to read you a quote, which I'm sure you know well, from Mr. Charles Krauthammer. "Not since William Randolph Hearst famously cabled his correspondent in Cuba, 'You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war,' has a newspaper so blatantly devoted its front pages to editorializing about a coming American war as has Howell Raines' New York Times."
That would be your fault.
Well, this has been a drumbeat of conservatives that the Times has taken off against the war. Many liberals believe that the Times has essentially rolled over and is reporting these war plans and so on, and seems to, for example, the piece today, U.S. taking steps to lay foundation for action in Iraq. Someone said to me earlier, it's like CNN with Countdown Iraq. I guess my question comes down to, how do you decide if a leak like that is news, or if you're simply being used by someone with an agenda within the government who's trying perhaps to allay the plans that they're leaking?
Well, I mean, which of those questions you want to take the last one?
Every one of them.
Okay. I can't explain why Charles took leave of his senses. I think he'd be the best witness on that. Virtually every conversation that takes place in Washington takes place because someone wants to gain an advantage of some sort. People don't put out information that they regard as contrary to their interest. There are several levels to the game. I mean, one is governments lie, including the American government. Another is that people put out positions to advance policy positions against the interests of their colleagues within their structures, Defense Department, let's say, hawks, doves, etc. And journalism is intellectual activity. That includes the ability to discriminate among different kinds of information and to make a calibration about the interests that are involved. I'm taken aback at you're quoting an unnamed colleague about that story, because that strikes me as such a naive interpretation of that story that I'm almost at a loss to respond to it. The information need that it's meant to answer is, if a reader wants to know where the United States is on the timeline that could lead to military action, that's the story that's designed to answer that information need. If you read it as a piece of advocacy, then I think that's a factor that it's really hard. It strikes me as such a misreading of what a newspaper report is about that it's hard to respond to in any logical way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, can I tackle the quote that you read from, who was it, Charlie Krauthammer? Krauthammer. This is a fascinating time for us as a society. We're actually engaged, for the first time in my memory, in an ongoing national debate as to whether or not this country should go to war. And those debates, at least in my experience, which is heavily flavored by the Vietnam War experience, which was my growing up, those debates always seem to take place after Americans are already in combat, not before. I think whether you think we should go to war, whether you think we shouldn't go to war, or whether you feel you don't have the information you need to make either of those decisions, what is healthy here is we're having this national debate. That's our job. That's Howell's and my job and other journalists, is to ensure that that debate is open, is honest, that we can marshal the facts we need to let the American citizens decide what's the best course of action.
You know, I don't get the impression, though, that most Americans really feel that the debate has been, I mean, this obviously isn't the Times' fault, but that the debate has been full, open, and thorough.
I think that's right. It hasn't been.
But
I think that's right. It has not been, and I would love, speaking as an American as well as a newspaper publisher, I'd love to have this administration more engaged in that discussion and the debate.
We had the Fulbright hearings, on China, Vietnam. I mean, we haven't had such a thing.
Well, that was very late.
Well, Mark, I think, with respect, I think you're missing something there. If there's an absence of debate in the country, if the Congress is not standing up to the administration in a adversarial way on issues of national import, that's a news story. That condition is part of what we report. Now, part of what set off this kind of rant that you read there is that we reported the fact that important Republicans, such as Brent Scowcroft, thought that the process by which Bush was pushing the country toward military action was imperfect in two main ways. One is that it had not examined the diplomatic and political framework that needed to be put in place, and two, it had not looked at the military situation in terms of whether this was a practical application of American force. It was a debate, a submerged debate within the Republican Party, including people like Scowcroft and Jim Baker, who were very close to Bush Sr. So it was us bringing to light that subterranean debate that led to this outburst and some others in the conservative press.
Mm-hmm. How do you stop from overcompensating, as it were, when you get that kind of criticism? That is, this has been, the Krauthammer quote is just obviously the tip of the iceberg. It was a great stir, and the perception has persisted that the Times is conducting a campaign against the war, at least in conservative circles. And indeed, you can sit here and say, well, gee, here's Arthur Salzberger. He has lunch every week with the editorial page editor, and they're against the war. And here's Howell Raines, and he was the editorial page editor an eye blink ago, and they're publishing these leaks in the paper and so on. How do you stop the conservative criticism from hitting, in some way, affecting your editorial decisions about what you're publishing?
You put any kind of criticism in an intellectual framework. The ladder of connections that you just ran through is from a Weekly Standard editorial. I don't know if you're quoting it.
No, it's all mine.
But that was exactly what the Weekly Standard put out. The Weekly Standard is the publication that was founded to promote Rupert Murdoch's political ideology in the United States. So when one hears that vein of criticism, one considers the source. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean to say that it's not a disinterested intellectual comment. It is a piece of political advocacy. And you should have the balance to, as a journalist, to be able to interpret it and process that. I mean, what we do is set out, the beacon that we sail toward is giving the best information that we can at any given time to our readers. That is to say, both the events that are happening and a sophisticated historical, diplomatic, political, contextual analysis of that information. And you sail toward that beacon, and you don't let the winds from either side buffet you off course. It's not, to me, it's not that hard to understand. It's a process, I think, that we've not adequately explained, perhaps we here being the serious press as an institution, have perhaps not adequately explained to our readers.
As you sail toward that beacon, you're constantly attacking and making decisions, which are indeed the daily work of journalism. I have to point to a piece that I wanted to ask you about, which was a front-page piece on August 18th by Patrick Tyler. Officers say U.S. aided Iraq in war despite use of gas. Extraordinary piece that had special interest to me because the time they're talking about, 1988, was when Saddam gassed the Kurds. I and many other people wrote about it, and in fact the Reagan administration basically said nothing about it. And this was a remarkable piece because, I don't know if it's bugged many of you, but President Bush constantly says he gasses his own people, as if the United States had protested at the time, which they didn't. This piece to me is remarkable because it actually goes into the history of what happened during that time, how the U.S. was involved, and so on. And it's sophisticated, very sophisticated historically, and it appeared on the front page of the paper. I think this is a great piece, and I'd like to ask you, first of all, how it came about. Secondly, why aren't there more, and we're essentially engaged in a debate that is built on history, about Saddam, why he gassed his people, why he attacked Iran, and so on. And I think a lot of people have the perception that there's a lot of disinformation out there about what the history was. Why can't you do more pieces like this?
I've never thought of walking up to it exactly that way, Mark. It's an interesting formulation. Why can't you do more like that? I guess the answer is they're hard. I mean, why haven't you written more pieces about massacres like El Mozote? I mean, you know, you shoot your best shot at any given time. Let me walk you back in that story a bit. Pat Tyler came to that story with a depth of experience that not many people in the United States, or in the world for that matter, have. He was on the battlefield in the Iraq-Iran war. And he knew from experience on the ground there that there were signs of use of chemical weapons, atropine cartridges and so forth, that he had information that he would have had only from being there. And then he was able, years later, to develop intelligence sources who would acknowledge the critical point in the story, which is that the Pentagon had intelligence operatives in there who were helping the Iraqis with targeting of and troop deployment information about the Iranians. Those same officers knew that, in all likelihood, once they revealed this information, that chemical weapons would be used against them. That's not a piece of information that the Pentagon announces at a press briefing. And I don't know any other reporter in the business right now who could have gotten that story except Patrick. So why don't we do it more often? Because at the moment there's only one Patrick Tyler in America, and luckily he works for us. But they don't, those reporters don't come along every day. Those conditions don't come along every day. And finally, the ability 10 years after the fact, or the luck 10 years after the fact, or the conscience-driven conversation 10 years after the fact in which somebody comes out and says, this is what's really going on. Those conditions are not ones that one can dictate.
Let me give you a specific example. Along with a litany about Saddam, along with gassing his own people, frequently comes and he's attacked his neighbor. He's twice attacked his neighbors, sometimes more than that. There is an argument that Saddam was given a green light by the Carter administration to stop the Iranian Revolution. I mean, it's more than an argument. It's in Brzezinski's memoirs. It's part of the public record in one way or another. Why isn't that kind of history in the Times?
There's a geopolitical aspect to this that's worth noting. I thought that's where you want to go. At the time that the Pentagon decided to give military aid to Iraq, Iran was using the waves of volunteers, the human wave attacks. And the motivation of the U.S. government to supply military intelligence information to Iraq was that they thought if Iran overran Iraq, it would destabilize the whole region. And it was better to have two contesting powers in that region, Iran and Iraq, than to have a defeated Iraq. I thought that was a dimension of the story that needed to be brought out. Now, your story is your question is why we didn't have what Brzezinski said about...
Well, in other words,
I don't understand the...
I mean, it goes along with your point, which is that the U.S. essentially green-lighted the invasion, Saddam's invasion of Iran, also in the interest of stopping, earlier we're talking about, of stopping the Iranian Revolution and its threat to countries in the Gulf, which is a matter of public record, and it seems would be part of the, should be part of the public debate. But how does that become a story? In other words, if the president is essentially...
That's a very old story. I mean, so it's unlikely that we were going to put a lot of resources into retelling a twice-told tale. It may be germane to the context of the current conflict. With respect, it doesn't seem to me to be an astonishing bit of news that the United States has manipulated with hostile powers for its own advantage, and I'm not sure it really rocks the world in terms of helping us understand what's going on right now.
But if the argument, just one last point, if the argument is that Iraq is inherently an expansionist power and attacks its neighbors, and that is said day after day in the press and examined, isn't it relevant that the United States indeed backed a major act of expansion that is being now put on the sort of bill of attainder against Saddam? I mean, I guess what I'm concerned about is the information that people have when they try to make decisions. I'm talking about sophisticated people, people who read the New York Times, when they're looking at a decision about, as Arthur said, when they're looking at a decision about war and peace, and they're hearing something that really tells them something rather different than the historical record, to those who know it, reveals.
Okay, I assume that applause means someone understood the question. So,
I think my mother started it. Yeah.
So I'm going to hack through there and take my best shot. Let me go back to your first formulation. You said, if the argument is thus and so. We're not in an argument here. We, as a news organization, we are in a reporting task, which is to try to bring forward what is being said. If the United States government, if the president, continues to say something erroneous, as they did in Vietnam every day, month after month, year after year, two things have to happen. One is we report what they say because our readers have a right to know what is being said, whether it's right, wrong, foolish, or wise, from elected political officials. Two, it puts on, hear that, there is a stenographic role in the news business, that is, people want to know what is happening at any time. That's to not say you endorse that. It says you fulfill your duty to tell your readers. Then you have an additional journalistic obligation of putting that up to the test of the information about the real world. This plays out over time. You know, it took months, years of battlefield reporting in Vietnam to countervail the information that was being put out at the Pentagon, and indeed only 2 years ago when Michael Beschloss's book came out, when McNamara's book came out in 93 or 94, did we learn that McNamara himself, the engineer of that information, knew at the time that it was false. So these things don't fall into place immediately.
Let me maybe ask a slightly different kind of question. Bring it back closer to home. Arthur, we were talking off stage about how you came to occupy your place, and the allusion to North Korea and Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il came up, and you said the difference was that they were only 2 generations and your family was 4. Now, on the face of
I don't like where this is going. One damn day.
Well, I'm gonna vacate North Korea.
And if you don't be a little more careful, I may nuke you.
My question is really, I mean, the New York Times is governed and held in a very unique way in corporate America. It is a family company, and the family, I assume, decides who the successor is in a way that isn't either particularly corporate or democratic. And tell us a little bit about that and what effect you think it has on how this great paper can deport itself in the world. What does it free you of that other media outlets are not freed of in terms of pressures?
There's a lot behind that question. First of all, just to get it on the record, the family did go for talent. Some of our best journalistic organizations are, in fact, family dominated. The Washington Post and the Graham family. Dow Jones is the Bancroft family owns the controlling shares of Dow Jones. So I think that's not as unusual as you might think. Knight Ridder, to a lesser degree, is although I'm not sure exactly what their stock structure is. I believe McClatchy in this state is still a family-controlled company from a stock point of view. And so some of our finest journalistic organizations are of that sort. What does it give us? Perhaps a stable base. The ability to, even for those of us who do buy into the market and buy into the strength that being part of the capital market system gives you, it still gives you a sense that if you need to, you can leverage past that. Shared commitment. The family values are important. It wasn't really until I got the job of publisher that I really began to see how much the Salzberger family's values are inculcated in the New York Times. We have some of the same strengths and weaknesses on the corporate side that we do on the family side. And that's both good or bad, good and bad, but it's a reality.
Do you have errant cousins who call you up and say, "Damn it, what are you doing here? We're pushing out that, section with no ads."
No, actually not. In truth, the family subscribes to the journalistic principles of the company in such a deep and rich way that it's every year when we get together, and we do, to talk about the state of the business, journalistically and from a financial point of view. Their reaffirmation of what we're doing is really is heartwarming and it's a great strength.
And to what do you attribute that kind of sense of unity, whereas many companies have fallen apart with families breaking up, wanting to sell off, cash out?
We work at it. We work at it very hard. We have shared values that came from our grandparents, from Imogene and Arthur Hayes Salzberger, transferred to their children, our parents, and hopefully we're transferring those same values to our children. Not hopefully, I know we are. We work hard at making sure that the family is aligned around the principles of the company, what we call our rules of the road, our behaviors. We bring them in. They meet, and Howell spoken to this group many a time, as has Janet Robinson, as has Russ Lewis. So it's something we don't take for granted. We work very hard at it. And yes, as the family grows, it becomes a little more complex. That's a bit of a challenge.
How many are there now, cousins?
723,000.
I thought that was it.
Mm-hmm. And Howell, what's your attitude towards this family? What's your relationship to this family, and how do you view them?
I wanted to add something to what Arthur said. One of the things that I think is very important that's going on now is the younger people in this family are coming up, have unrestricted access to people like me when they come to the paper for the annual meeting. And by that, by unrestricted, I should say unmediated. In other words, I have lunch with a group of 8 or 10, and several of my colleagues do, and these are people ranging from early teen through postgraduate age. And they get to ask us anything they want to about the paper without Uncle Arthur there to check up on whether they're polite or rude or well-informed or not well-informed.
They all make suggestions, every one of them?
No, mostly it's it's mostly wanting to know the process by which we do this peculiar thing that we do. If it were easy to understand or we were better at explaining it, perhaps, I could give smoother answers to some of your questions. It's a hard, intricate process that is supported by this extraordinary ownership. And what the family is doing so well from a standpoint of an employee is communicating to the future generations, hey, this is not a Coke dealership that you're inheriting an interest in. This is a public trust. And that's, for me, after being a journalist since 1964, to be able to be part not only of this great newspaper, but part of the process of passing along our values to the future generations, not only of the practitioners in the newsroom, but the potential owners of the papers, is extremely valuable.
Did you communicate them the intention to publish this section without ads for so many months? Are those sorts of decisions day-to-day discussed with the family?
The family is not the board of directors. We have an independent board of directors. And quite frankly, we wouldn't have communicated to our board of directors our decision to do this. This was a decision made by the management of the newspaper, and it's in its judgment, and fully supported subsequently by the board and by the family, which is quite frankly very proud of what Howell and his newsroom has done, and the support that the newsroom got from our business side, which was looking at a very tough year. Let's not forget what that year was like from a business point of view. It was a brutal year. 9/11 comes along and makes a brutal year even worse, again from a financial point of view. And in the end, that's okay. This is what we're in the business to do.
Did that decision actually cost the Times a lot of money? I mean, there seems to be some dispute because supposedly the circulation gains...
There's no dispute. In retrospect, it didn't. And we did not know that at the time. But the circulation, as you just suggested, the circulation gains covered the cost of that special section. We had no way of knowing that. And quite frankly, if it hadn't, it wouldn't. That would have been okay too. That it did, and that our readership grew by such a substantial amount, is really a sign that we're on the right road. Quality journalism pays.
This is a very strange business model, I think, for much of the rest of corporate America to hear. Quality pays, and foreign journalism sells, and family feudalism rather than democracy, corporate, whatever. I mean, I'm a great fan of this paper, and I'm very intrigued that such a curious structure should lead to such a great institution.
How can anyone who works at a university be surprised by this?
I think if we were family-owned,
nobody consults us.
We might have a very different kettle of fish here. It could be worse. I don't know, but it does strike me as an amazing anomaly in a way. This New York Times.
Well, let me ask specifically. You know, there are analysts who say that part of this business model is demanding much higher profits from Times acquisitions and possessions, the other papers, and so on, than from the jewel in the crown itself. Is that accurate?
We're going to get into a very esoteric discussion that will make the conversation that you and Howell engaged in seem almost understandable.
Would you rather move to questions from the audience?
That's a high mark you've got to meet there.
Yes, I know.
Let me see if I can complicate the question for you.
In a nutshell, the profit margin of the New York Times newspaper is lower, margin-wise, than that of a regional newspaper. That's just the nature of regional newspapers versus major metros. Right? On the other hand, there is no more profitable newspaper in a pure cash term than the New York Times.
Well,
so the margin is lower, but it flows. It spins off more cash, and so the result is that the acquisitions that we make are really funded by the New York Times newspaper's cash flow. Mm-hmm. Got it now?
Now, Mark, let's do one more question here because we've got to
Wait
get to
till I
the
get
audience.
to EBITDA. You're going to love this.
All right, let me jump over the esoteric from the business side and ask a question that people have been putting to me the last couple of days. Which is more directly on point on foreign coverage. I've had the question put in many different ways. Why is there no bureau on the West Bank or Gaza? That is, why is the reporting in Israel all from the Israeli side? Why is there not an Arabic-speaking reporter stationed in Ramallah, for example, where Haaretz has one and sometimes two very good reporters? There's interest in this, as you can see. I'm sure you've had that question put to you before.
Actually not in that form. It's an interesting one. Let's take the basing part of it first. Mm-hmm. It presumes that where you sit influences how you think. And all I can do, Mark, is keep going back to the fundamental principle. This is an intellectual enterprise. The people we send over there, their address does not determine where they go, what they think. You could say, suppose, that if they were based in Gaza, they would have a different daily experience. The fact is that Our people are all over the country. They're in Gaza constantly.
I think to do justice
I
to the question.
I don't want to interrupt your question, but maybe my answer has a couple
Well,
more
I was just
sides.
going to say that I think this is a version of a question that essentially reflects the concern that the subtlety of the reporting on the Israel side, and especially its attention to politics, is not in any way mirrored by the reporting from the Palestinian side, which is thought to be rather black and white, at least by a lot of readers I've spoken to.
Yeah. Well, you're telling me someone's perception. I can't argue with their perception or your perception. I can tell you that as a matter of professional practice and judgment, I don't think our reporting out of Israel is unbalanced. Of life in Hebron, for example, which was there today.
I find the question fascinating, and if we were sitting in a New York audience right now, it would have come the exact opposite way. Why is the New York Times so anti-Israel? Why is it that all of your coverage is so pro-Palestinian? We're a newspaper that had rabbis telling their congregation, if that's the right term, not to buy the New York Times because until it changes coverage of the Middle East. So, maybe where you sit depends more than where our reporters are based on how you come at that.
Listen, I want to, since time is short, let's get to a few questions from the audience. Howell, this is addressed at you. Why were you so hard on Bill Clinton, and do you feel differently today?
The New York Times editorial page, which I used to run, and I'm out of the opinion business now, is a special trust. We endorsed Bill Clinton for the election. There was no more fervent advocate of the Clinton health care reform. We were still pushing for it after Hillary and Ira Magaziner packed it in. So on a policy base, there was no real issue between us and much of the Clinton domestic program and some of the Clinton, or most of the Clinton foreign policy program. Where we got off the train is when I saw as the editor, political behaviors that I could not in good conscience align the institution of the New York Times with endorsing. I said so. Would I do it differently? No, not in a minute. Not in. So that's the fairly compact answer we could go on.
You still believe he should have resigned?
I don't think we ever called for resignation. I'm sorry. Yeah, but.
How do you think history will remember?
No, I mean, this is one of the problems we have is sometimes the record of what we said gets muddied, and sometimes I even forget what we said. But in this case, Mark, what we said was that he should not be removed from office by the impeachment process, nor should he resign.
A question from the audience. It appeared to me that your coverage of the October 26 Iraq peace demonstration in Washington was quite contradictory. How did two different accounts appear over just a couple of days? And I remember this, I believe there were different numbers given for the number of people who participated and so on. Quite different stories in the paper.
Not really. The first story was incomplete. And I don't mean to be splitting hairs with you, but it said thousands when it should have said tens of thousands. When we became aware that we had undercovered the event, we went back and wrote a story that re-examined the number of people who were there and re-examined the organizational framework of the anti-war organizations that were putting it on.
Let's just stick with these questions here.
If they hadn't been marching, we could have gotten a better number. Not true. They weren't marching. That would be antithetical to our structure. This is going to get us in trouble. I apologize, Howell. We don't allow that.
Why is network news so silent on current events and so compromised?
Look. I'm not going to be a spokesman for network news or for the media. I have one concern, that's the New York Times.
And I'd like to respond to this comment actually about the March coverage. It does make a difference where your reporters are. In this case, we had 4 people in the field, and they simply didn't get it exactly right. That's why we went back to it. When my first year on the Times, I was standing with Abe Rosenthal at the bank where we read the papers, the bound volumes of the papers. A copy editor came up to Abe and said, here's a correction that's been suggested. And the fellow then went on to say that technically we didn't have to run it because of this and that reason. And Abe said, well, tell me something. In the main, were we right or were we wrong? And the copy editor said, we were wrong. He said, put it in the paper. In this business, there's only one thing to do when you're wrong, and that's get right as quick as you can. And so, the volume of information that we handle in any given day means there are going to be errors. We have a number of ways to try to revisit them, including a more complete story than the one. But the fact is, when you revisit the story, the error was a judgment error, not the number was 5 when it should have been 6. It was a matter of scale and interpretation and scope, and that's what we try to bring to our journalism, is a feel for the event, the context, the history, the whole picture.
Let me give you a much more difficult question and more grave. What were you thinking, putting Britney Spears on the front page of the New York Times?
Yeah.
Since many have asked me this, I have to bring it up. And please, there are obviously questions of demography of readers and other things that people perceive that to be about that I'd please address.
Okay. One of the things about our readers, we are convinced, both by evidence and as a matter of philosophy, that the reader of the New York Times is interested in every aspect of life in the world, not only foreign affairs, but the sociology of America, the culture of America, both classical culture and popular culture, the pulse of the country. Now, I was interested when Britney Spears went off the road last summer. I thought that was a moment to do a sociological piece about the nature of celebrity in this particular aspect of the music world and the economics that underlie it and the whole phenomenon of being flavor of the month and then nowhere the next day. The fact is we didn't move quickly enough on it. Then when Britney Spears fetched up in New York and then at the Armani Fashion Show, it was clear that there was a public relations reinvention strategy that was playing out that I thought had not been told in a sophisticated way. The story was not about Britney Spears. If you examine it, it was about the fame machine and the economic engine that underlies it. Similarly, 2 weeks ago, I was listening to radio and I heard a report that Snoop Doggy Dogg was trying to revive his career by insulting Suge Knight. I thought, well, that's interesting, because what is this?
Foreign policy question.
What is this really about? What it's really about is huge corporations like Sony battling over a multi-billion-dollar market that has had a 20% decline in sales this year. So the next day, when a disc jockey was shot in New York, we jumped right on that to write a piece about the rap wars, not about whether Snoop Dogg has insulted Suge's mother, which is pure smoke. The issue is how much money Sony's going to get, how much money these other entities are going to get, and how they program these displays to feed a major element in the American music industry. Now, let me just say this. My presumption is that our readers are interested in reading a sophisticated exegesis of a sociological phenomenon like that.
Let me follow up. Let me follow up briefly. It's interesting that so many people point to that story because I think it perhaps relates to an underlying worry or insecurity that the Times is going to change in a search for younger readers in some way. And are you trying to get younger readers? And is that
or do you want them all
security?
just to die off?
Yes, exactly.
We love all of our readers, regardless of age. Yes, we're going to change. One of the great moments back in the late 80s, early 90s, when we began to grapple with what it would mean to change the Times for the next generation of readers and advertisers, that led to the creation of the 6-section color newspaper, that a greater commitment to the national edition, satellite printing in Boston and Washington, the creation of a Northeast edition, all of those changes, which I hope you've all seen and gotten used. Color on the front page, remember that? The debate? We were going to put color on the front page at the end of the Times. We did a lot of reader research, and one of the most compelling moments came from a non-reader, a like-minded non-reader. In other words, somebody who we think has all the characteristics to like the New York Times, but doesn't actually read us. And he was in this group, and we were taking them through the changes that we were thinking about. And he was appalled. And he said, the New York Times is a great institution. It is an icon in our society. I don't read it, but you can't change it. So change is a difficult process, but if you stop changing, you're going to start to diminish what you are, not to enhance what you are. So our challenge, Howell's and mine and our colleagues in New York and elsewhere, is to change within the context of continuing to appeal to our loyalists, the people hopefully in this audience, while also bringing in the next generation, not just in print, but on the web, in television, in books, all of the myriad ways we think we can expand on our journalism.
Let's do two.
I want to do a follow-up,
okay,
if I may.
Plus, he likes Britney Spears.
Almost every question that we confront of this sort, Mark, has the idea that, well, if you're doing more local coverage, that you must be shortcutting foreign coverage, that there's a subtractive element. And what's important to understand about the Times is that our ambitions are additive. Right now, and let me tell you why, as Flannery O'Connor said, everything that rises must converge. For the kind of leadership we have, many of these things do converge. You're interested in foreign affairs. This audience is, I am. I also want us to get much better at reporting the world of popular culture. Why? That doesn't mean we'll ever abandon classical culture. I happen to be a big ballet fan. We'll always be there. But we want to get better at reporting about the popular culture machine in Hollywood, because they are speaking and inventing and manipulating a global language that is affecting governments in Africa, in Asia, and in China, and around the world. So if you narrow your coverage to fit, a Council on Foreign Relations pie chart or a Rolling Stone pie chart, you're not going to get the breadth of coverage that our readers demand and that we're committed to giving to them.
One final question. Why do so many people take such a dim view of journalists?
Good taste.
They know us.
What's going on here?
I don't know. Orville.
Not my question now.
No. I thought it was your question.
Disgruntled audience member.
It's been my experience that anyone in America who's perceived as having influence, whether it's the proverbial used car dealer or the HMOs or lawyers, you name the list, has an understandable level of resentment and shove back. I think that's a healthy element of what is, in many ways, a very adversarial society. I mean, this society, in many ways, is founded on competition and on zero-sum, what is perceived as zero-sum kind of contest.
Well, I think also, if I can just add one last thought, it is a moment. It's also the time we're in. It is a time when people are polarized. And when often legitimate debate gives way to demonizing your enemies. And I'm not speaking about our enemies outside of the borders. I'm speaking about people with different points of view on important, critical subjects. It's easier to demonize your enemies than it is to engage in a dialogue and a discussion. And we're seeing that play out in the far-right press, and we're seeing it play out in the far-left press of this country, and we are not benefiting as a society from it. Journalists as part of our mandate, is to bring people news, not always good news. In fact, rarely good news, and it's often easier to in the old saw to kill the messenger than to listen to try to understand what the message is. So I think we're also trapped in that moment.
Well, listen, before we wear you out, let me thank you on behalf of everybody at Berkeley. It's been very gracious of you to be here. It's been fun. Thank you.